Hello, virtual class. It's your instructor, Mr. Mormon, and today we're going to be talking about the genre of fairy tales. Now, as we're talking about fairy tales, I want you to think about this. This is a writing intensive unit we're doing, and we're not looking at fairy tales as a reader right now. We're looking at fairy tales as a writer. So put on your writer's cap and think about the tools fairy tales use, not just the way it makes the reader feel. So let's look at the basic definition. This is not the writer definition or the reader definition. This is just, what a dictionary might call a fairy tale. This is from literary-terms.net. Fairy tale is a story, often intended for children, that features fanciful and wondrous characters such as elves, goblins, wizards, and even, but not necessarily, fairies. The term fairy tale seems to refer more to the fantastical and magical setting or magical influence within a story, rather than the presence of the character of a fairy within the story. Fairy tales are often traditional. Many were passed down from storyteller to storyteller before being recorded in books. Let's note some things they mention. It's passed down by word of mouth. That's important to think about with fairy tales, and we'll dive into that more. It's often intended for children. That's kind of a loaded way to say this, but many fairy tales are what we call didactic. Didactic means having a hidden agenda or goal. So fairy tales often teach morals to children. That's why they were intended for children. And then the fanciful and wondrous creatures and characters list. That's just basic fantasy elements that fairy tales inspired in a lot of Western literature. But think about that, Western literature. Okay, and just to be clear, fairy tales and fantasy are different. So fairy tales kind of created all these cool fantasy characters we have, but fantasy uses them a different way. So fairy tale and fantasy both have dragons, but a fairy tale will use the dragon to teach a didactic lesson to the reader through a method called allegory, where you make your entire story serve as a metaphor for something. Fantasy, on the other hand, is a little more complex and isn't quite as direct in its lesson teaching. So, let's look at common aspects of the fairy tale genre from a writer perspective. We looked at the definition. Now let's look at themes and trends that I noticed emerging when I read through. We can add to this list as a class if we have more noticings, however. Usually, I've noticed the story focus on a central moral lesson. Again, this is called allegory, and we'll dive in more into that later. It features evil and inhuman antagonists. So, like, the wolf in Little Riding Hood, he's a talking wolf who's a monster, and he's very inhuman, very beastly. Explores the good and naive protagonist. Little Red Riding Hood, again, is very representative of this trope. The protagonist is always too good for their own good. Explores a cultural or social issue. Metaphor of evil antagonist and good protagonist can sometimes do this. Fate of protagonist, happy or sad ending, and what mistakes do they make to get them there. Overall story is allegory for social issues like we've talked about earlier. Features magical elements, that's just mythical creatures, creatures from folklore. Um, Story is driven forward by action. This is the more technical things I've noticed, but it's not a lot of passive voice, it's active voice. You see, um, oftentimes the subject of a sentence is just doing something onto something and not the other way around. So it's a very active writing style that puts onus on keeping the story moving. And earlier with that definition with that from literary-terms.net, they really only listed, I guess we could call them Western fantasy elements. But if we go ahead and open this link right here, which is just a list from the New York Public Library of multicultural fairy tales and folktales book list, you'll see there's books from all over. The Caribbean, Mexican, Chinese, Danish, Native American, Bengali, Yiddish, Irish. It's true that really fairy tales exist across cultures. And then let me go back there. So just keep that in mind. Although when we think fairy tales, we think Western tropes, wizards, skeletons, etc. When a Japanese person thinks fairy tale, they might think something like Spirited Away, where there's representatives of the yokai, and specifically, I have a list right here. You got the Kamakushi, which is the protagonist Chihiro is taken from her mortal realm with her parents to this realm of kind of Japanese ghosts. Mikado, spirit behind a mask. That's that spirit no face up in the top right. That's the character without the movie. And Kappa, water spirit. Uh, as a commentary on global warming, they have dirty water spirits covered in mud, but that's also another thing represented. So to Japanese eyes, Spirited Away is a fairy tale because of the Eastern fantasy elements and the very clear moral. So that's something to consider. You know, um, fairy tales are more expansive than we realize, and we can't discount any one culture or context when looking at them. So we did talk about Spirited Away earlier. Before you were supposed to watch this video, you were supposed to engage a Spirited Away's clip and write a response if you thought it was a fairy tale. And if I haven't changed your mind, that's fine. You can defend your original opinion. But I want you to email an exit slip responding to your initial piece of writing. After watching this lecture, did your original opinion about fairy tales change? Like, do you think fairy tales expand past the Western Hemisphere yet? Or did you already think that, you know? Is having lists of specific magical elements harmful? I mean, in that literary terms .NET definition, do you think it was bad that they listed specific Western examples? Or do you think it's okay because with some research you can figure it out, you know? And again, do you think this is specific to Western ideas? Do you think maybe I'm wrong and that you could see wizards and werewolves in any fairy tale? And there's an argument to be made there. And here's the list again: elves, goblins, wizards, even fairies. I thought Lord of the Rings. That's why I made the argument about the Western focus. But yeah, just engage with me in this exit slip and tell me what you're thinking.